Hi. The fourth essay in The Art of Literature is Schopenhauer's reflections on the study of Latin. And this is a short essay, but it is one of my favorites in this volume. I think Schopenhauer gives a type of advice and judgments that are very clear, and some of which may be somewhat surprising to us in the 21st century. I think this is in part because the place of Latin in our culture, both in popular culture or in academic culture and in non-academic culture, is quite different from in Schopenhauer's time. Here's how the essay begins. The abolition of Latin as the universal language of learned men, together with the rise of that provincialism which attaches to national literatures, has been a real misfortune for the cause of knowledge in Europe. For it was chiefly through the medium of the Latin language that a learned public existed in Europe at all, a public to which every book as it came out directly appealed. The number of minds in the whole of Europe that are capable of thinking and judging is small as it is, but when that audience is broken up and severed by differences of language, the good these minds can do is very much weakened. This is a great disadvantage. But a second and worse one will follow, namely, that the ancient languages will cease to be taught at all. The neglect of them is rapidly gaining ground, both in France and Germany. If it should really come to this, then farewell humanity, farewell noble taste and high thinking. The age of barbarism will return in spite of railways, telegraphs, and balloons. We shall thus, in the end, lose one more advantage possessed by all our ancestors. For Latin is not only the key to the knowledge of Roman antiquity, it also directly opens up to us the Middle Age in every country of Europe, and modern times as well, down to about the year 1750. Erigena, for example, in the 9th century, John of Salisbury in the 12th, Raymond Lully in the 13th, with 100 others, speak straight to us in the very language that they naturally adopted in thinking of learned matters. They thus come quite close to us even at this distance of time. We are in direct contact with them and really come to know them. How would it have been if every one of them spoke in the language that was peculiar to his time and country? We should not understand even the half of what they said. A real intellectual contact with them would be impossible. We should see them like shadows on the farthest horizon, or maybe through the translator's telescope. It was with an eye to the advantage of writing in Latin that Bacon, as he himself expressly states, proceeded to translate his essays into that language, under the title Sermones Fideles, at which work Hobbes assisted him. Schopenhauer tells us that there are two advantages, at least, to studying the Latin language, and the first is unity. There's a certain advantage that is had by the men of the past ages in being able to speak directly to each other without translators in the language in which they were thinking. And he says, since there really are so very few men in each generation that have truly great intellects, this is a tremendous advantage. We don't have to require a great intellect on the part of their translators as well in order for them to sort of try to figure out what each other means. The second advantage is that we as readers now can encounter the ancients from Cicero all the way to the Middle Ages or perhaps even up into the 18th century. We can read them in the same language they were thinking in, so we can have direct access to their minds in the way that we wouldn't if we were having to work through a translator or through multiple different translators coming from Greek to Latin to French to German to English. And I think he's largely correct about this. It seems to me there is a great value to be had in the understanding that we can have by reading somebody in the language in which they were writing and therefore in the language in which they were thinking. So in the next section, Schopenhauer is going to talk about the difficulties of national prejudice and the ways in which it would affect and distort our understanding of people's thoughts. Here's what he writes. Here let me observe, by way of parentheses, that when patriotism tries to urge its claims in the domain of knowledge, it commits an offense which should not be tolerated. For in those purely human questions which interest all men alike, where truth, insight, beauty should be of sole account, what can be more impertinent than to let preference for the nation to which a man's precious self happens to belong affect the balance of judgment, and thus supply a reason for doing violence to truth, and being unjust to the great minds of a foreign country in order to make much of the smaller minds of one's own? Still, there are writers in every nation in Europe who afford examples of this vulgar feeling. It is this which led Ierarte to caricature them in the 33rd of his charming literary fables. Translator's note: Tomás de Ierarte, 1750 to 1791, a Spanish poet and keeper of the archives in the War Office at Madrid. His two best-known works are a didactic poem entitled La Música and the Fables here quoted, which satirize the peculiar foibles of literary men. They have been translated into many languages, into English by Rockcliffe, 3rd edition, 1866. The fable in question describes how, at a picnic of the animals, a discussion arose as to which of them carried off the palm for superiority of talent. The praises of the ant, the dog, the bee, and the parrot were sung in turn. But at last the ostrich stood up and declared for the dromedary, whereupon the dromedary stood up and declared for the ostrich. No one could discover the reason for this mutual compliment. Was it because both were such uncouth beasts, or had such long necks, or were neither of them particularly clever or beautiful? Or was it because each had a hump? No, said the fox, you are all wrong. Don't you see they are both foreigners? Cannot the same be said of many men of learning? So, patriotism, he tells us, is out of place in intellectual life. We should not lower ourselves by degrading and criticizing great minds and elevating mediocre minds merely because of group membership. It seems that as an intellectual, our first loyalty is to be a citizen of the Republic of Letters. We need to be interested in the truth and in excellence in thought, not in whether this particular person happens to come from the same country as our own precious self. And I'd note as well, though Schopenhauer doesn't say it, this also applies to other group loyalties and affinities, to religious membership or identification with some kind of social group. That if we're willing to elevate to overpraise the mediocre intellects on our own side and to disdain or tear down superior intellects on the other side, there's a sense in which we really ought not be even calling what we do intellectual life or thinking or writing at all. And of course, the great amusing dramatization of this brought to us by Saunders, the translator, in his footnote, is the Spanish writer Ierarte's Fable of the Animals, which highlights the absurdity of thinking of a group of people as being collectively foreigners, therefore having this kind of interest and solidarity as foreigners, right? The ostrich, etc., etc. So in the next section, Schopenhauer will talk to us about the way in which learning a language is going to develop new patterns of thought in our minds. Here's what he writes. In learning a language, the chief difficulty consists in making acquaintance with every idea which it expresses, even though it should use words for which there is no exact equivalent in the mother tongue. And this often happens. In learning a new language, a man has, as it were, to mark out in his mind the boundaries of quite new spheres of ideas, with the result that spheres of ideas arise where none were before. Thus, he not only learns words, he gains ideas too. This is nowhere so much the case as in learning ancient languages, for the differences they present in their mode of expression, as compared with modern languages, is greater than can be found amongst modern languages as compared with one another. This is shown by the fact that in translating into Latin, recourse must be had to quite other turns of phrase than are used in the original. The thought that is to be translated has to be melted down and recast. In other words, it must be analyzed and then recomposed. It is just this process which makes the study of the ancient languages contribute so much to the education of the mind. It follows from this that a man's thought varies according to the language in which he speaks. His ideas undergo a fresh modification, a different shading, as it were, in the study of every new language. Hence, an acquaintance with many languages is not only of much indirect advantage, but it is also a direct means of mental culture, in that it corrects and matures ideas by giving prominence to their many-sided nature and their different varieties of meaning, as also that it increases dexterity of thought. For in the process of learning many languages, ideas become more and more independent of words. The ancient languages effect this to a greater degree than the modern, in virtue of the difference to which I have alluded. To learn a new language means to learn to think differently. It's to acquire new boundaries. It's sort of to explore unexplored territory in our minds and to acquire new ideas. And Schopenhauer says this effect is even greater when we, as native speakers of modern languages, are studying ancient languages. We're unlocking patterns of thought and types of ideas and modes of expression which are not available to us in any other way. He also has a great metaphor here of melting down and recasting ideas. This is the great value, he thinks, of translating into Latin things that are written in our own language. Why? Because it requires us to analyze and then to recompose the idea in a different idiom, with different turns of phrase, different modes of expression. And this is itself a way of guaranteeing that we acquire a certain level of understanding. So he thinks translating into Latin can be a tremendous benefit to us for our understanding of what we're talking about in our own language. And of course, then the more languages you learn and speak, the wider your range of ideas becomes. And I think he thinks the more independent you become of the limits of any single language. There's a way in which if you only speak your own language, you only think the way that your own language encourages you to think. And so to expand beyond that, to acquire not just maybe one foreign language, but multiple foreign languages, your thought is acquiring a certain amount of independence and ability to move between the different thought patterns and horizons that are available to speakers of each of these different languages. In the next section, Schopenhauer is going to talk about the value of Latin for becoming a good writer in your own language. Here's what he says. From what I have said, it is obvious that to imitate the style of the ancients in their own language, which is so very much superior to ours in point of grammatical perfection, is the best way of preparing for a skillful and finished expression of thought in the mother tongue. Nay, if a man wants to be a great writer, he must not omit to do this, just as, in the case of sculpture or painting, the student must educate himself by copying the great masterpieces of the past before proceeding to original work. It is only by learning to write Latin that a man comes to treat diction as an art. The material in this art is language, which must therefore be handled with the greatest care and delicacy. The result of such study is that a writer will pay keen attention to the meaning and value of words, their order and connection, their grammatical forms. He will learn how to weigh them with precision, and so become an expert in the use of that precious instrument which is meant not only to express valuable thought, but to preserve it as well. Further, he will learn to feel respect for the language in which he writes, and thus be saved from any attempt to remodel it by arbitrary and capricious treatment. Without this schooling, a man's writing may easily degenerate into mere chatter. The best way to become a writer in your native language, says Schopenhauer, is to learn Latin, because there is a certain amount of artistry involved in language. So just as we would tell a sculptor to imitate the great masters of the past, not because you will become their equal, but because struggling to do what they did will be a good instruction for you in the basics of the material. The basics of the material here that we're speaking about in writing is language, the way to use language and idioms well to communicate meaning, but also, as we've been talking about before, thought, to learn to think well, to think clearly, and to be able to say and express precisely what you mean. In the next and final section of this essay, Schopenhauer is going to speak about the dangers of remaining ignorant of Latin. Here's what he writes. To be entirely ignorant of the Latin language is like being in a fine country on a misty day. The horizon is extremely limited. Nothing can be seen clearly except that which is quite close. A few steps beyond, everything is buried in obscurity. But the Latinist has a wide view, embracing modern times, the Middle Age, and antiquity, and his mental horizon is still further enlarged if he studies Greek or even Sanskrit. If a man knows no Latin, he belongs to the vulgar, even though he be a great virtuoso on the electrical machine and have the base of hydrofluoric acid in his crucible. There is no better recreation for the mind than the study of the ancient classics. Take any one of them into your hand, be it only for half an hour, and you will feel yourself refreshed, relieved, purified, ennobled, strengthened, just as though you had quenched your thirst at some pure spring. Is this the effect of the old language and its perfect expression? Or is it the greatness of the minds whose works remain unharmed and unweakened by the lapse of 1,000 years? Perhaps both together. But this I know, if the threatened calamity should ever come, and the ancient languages cease to be taught, a new literature will arise of such barbarous, shallow, and worthless stuff as was never seen before. Schopenhauer tells us that the person who is ignorant of language is like a man moving around on a misty day. Everything, the horizon closes in on him. He's surrounded by mist or fog. What he can see, he sees in a sort of fuzzy way. You can't really make out the details or the colors. And inevitably, he cannot see very far, not nearly as far as he could if the fog were lifted. He is vulgar or low, even if he has many great scientific achievements, or we might say in our own time, tremendous technological marvels at his command. If he can't speak, read, and think in Latin, he is always going to live this kind of limited horizon, as he's always got kind of a fog bank just at the edge of his field of vision. Schopenhauer here also praises reading Latin as a form of recreation. It provides a kind of emotional lift. We might even say it's therapeutic. It will allow us to overcome, it will lift us up when we're low and allow us to overcome some of the misery of this life. And of course, at the end here, Schopenhauer gives this marvelous prophecy that if the study of Latin and Greek should ever fade away completely, they will be replaced by a barbarous, shallow, worthless literature of the kind the world has never seen before. I'll leave it to the judgment of each of you whether this has come to pass in our own time or perhaps in some time prior to today that we're living through right now. So those are Schopenhauer's thoughts on the study of Latin. He's in favor of it, but not for perhaps the reasons one might have supposed, not for nostalgic reasons, but because it feeds into a certain kind of excellence of thought and expression or writing in this book on the art of literature. Those are my comments on Schopenhauer's essay on the study of Latin. The next essay in this volume is titled On Men of Learning, and we'll look at that one in the next video. Thanks for watching today. Goodbye.